Mrs. Sains by Jhumpa Lahiri. Characters, Summary, Analysis. Hello and welcome to the discourse. Mrs. Sains is the title of the sixth story from the story collection Interpreter of Maladies by Jhumpa Lahiri, which won the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction in 2000. The story is about a lonely 11-year-old American boy and a lonely Indian woman, an immigrant from India, whose husband works as a mathematics professor at a university in New England, America. The story touches on the themes of loneliness, assimilation, cultural differences, and the differences between expectations and realities. Back at home, the Indian woman's family believes she is leading a life of glamour and luxury in America while facing opposite situations. Her flat at the University of America is shabby and nowhere near the luxuries of her home in India. She realizes that her husband's financial condition in America is no match to what they were used to in India. Furthermore, she suffers from loneliness and lack of social connection in the new place, especially because she is treated as an alien in the new country. Characters of Mrs. Sains. Mrs. Sain is the main character of the story. She is a lonely woman about 30 years old who desperately misses Calcutta, her home. Her husband took a job as a professor in a New England town. Life is very different for her there. Her husband is often busy with his university work. She refuses to learn to drive because it scares her, but the refusal also limits her experiences in her new country. She becomes a babysitter for Elliot, who comes to her house after school. The two share an unspoken loneliness. Elliot is the other main character. He is an 11-year-old who knows how to do everything himself. He just needs a babysitter to watch him in case of an emergency. Elliot lives with his single mother in a beach house. After the tourist season is over, the weather grows colder and the town becomes more desolate. His mother worries that he needs company and thus she arranges for him to be watched by Mrs. Sain, who is just as lonely as Elliot. Elliot is a precocious child. He is perceptive to the pain felt by both women, his mother and Mrs. Sain. Elliot's mother is a single parent, either divorced or separated from her husband. She is a working lady struggling to keep her life intact. Her struggle and frustration appear through Elliot, who notices that she skips her dinner and drinks too much wine and isolates herself. Mr. Sain is Mrs. Sain's husband. He is a professor of mathematics who moved from Calcutta to teach at a university in New England. He knows the struggles of Mrs. Sain and her loneliness but does not care much as he is too busy with his work at the university. Summary of Mrs. Sains. Elliot is an 11-year-old boy who lives at a beach house with his mother in New England. His mother is a single parent who needs to commute to a distant office to work. She tries babysitters for Elliot, but one of them is a vegan who refuses to prepare meat for Elliot, and the other is an alcoholic. His mother then notices Mrs. Sain's advertisement at supermarket, who is willing to serve as a babysitter at her home. Elliot's mom prefers to have Elliot looked after at their own house, but she makes an exception for Mrs. Sain since Mrs. Sain cannot drive. Elliot and his mother go to meet Mr. and Mrs. Sain at their shabby university apartment. Mrs. Sain wears a sari and traditional Indian makeup, and she and Mr. Sain take off their shoes and wear flip-flops indoors. Mrs. Sain offers tea and biscuits to Elliot's mother, but she refuses. Rather, she begins questioning Mr. Sain and Mrs. Sain to ascertain that her son will remain safe. She does not approve of the apartment complex and notices the low quality of the lobby furniture and uneven paint. However, her main concern is that Mrs. Sain cannot drive because she works 50 miles away and his father does not live nearby. Mr. Sain tells her that he is teaching Mrs. Sain how to drive and she should be ready to go by December. Elliot's mother notices that Mr. Sain's house is rather empty. Mrs. Sain clarifies that they have all their riches back in India. She also clarifies why she does not know how to drive because in India, where the Sains have all of their stuff, they have a chauffeur. Elliot notices that at the mention of India, Mrs. Sain becomes distracted and upset. Elliot's mother is wary of Mrs. Sain and her weird looking dresses, the Indian saris. However, she has no other option and thus she agrees to the arrangement. On the other hand, Elliot finds her beautiful. He likes her colorful saris. He rather feels his mother's clothes are gloomy and unattractive. Elliot begins going to Mrs. Sane's apartment after school. Elliot does not mind because the neighborhood he lives in does not have any other children for him to play with. Elliot learns to take off his shoes upon entering Mrs. Sane's apartment. As Elliot spends his days at Mrs. Sane's, he starts to like it there. His small beach house is cold in September, whereas Mrs. Sane's house is warm. The boy takes an active interest in watching Mrs. Sane's culinary preparations as she chops ingredients for the evening meal. He notices the special blade Mrs. Sane uses. Mrs. Sane notices his curiosity but does not allow him to go near the blade, afraid for his safety. As Mrs. Sane talks about her days back in India, Elliot notices that she is nostalgic for her native country. One evening, she tells Elliot that when she lived in India, she would prepare food with a community of women for celebrations, but in the US, she is lonely. She says that it often becomes difficult to sleep back in India because of the chattering of the neighboring women, but here in the US, she finds it difficult to sleep because of too much silence. Elliot thinks of how uneventful his life is with his mother, and how, when he asks her to go somewhere, she refuses and secludes herself from him. He learns that Mrs. Sane is deeply unsatisfied with her life in America, and he also notices his own loneliness. Mrs. Sane asks Elliot whether if she started screaming, anyone would come. At home, people would come running at the slightest commotion to share joy or grief. Elliot remembers a party that was thrown by a neighbor. He and his mother were not invited. Elliot says that someone might call to complain. He understands that home to Mrs. Sane means India and not the house they are presently in. In India, which Mrs. Sane keeps referring to as home, all she has to do is yell and the whole neighborhood will come rushing over to share the good or bad news. Mrs. Sane tells Elliot about bindi, the red dot she applies to her forehead with powder, which is custom for Indian women who are married. The dot symbolizes that she is married. When Elliot's mother comes to pick him up, Mrs. Sane hides all evidence of food preparation. Elliot's mother seems uncomfortable in the apartment, and she tries to refuse the food that Mrs. Sane offers her. When she and Elliot get home, she always drinks wine and orders pizza for dinner. Elliot notices that every afternoon, Mrs. Sane arrives early to wait for Elliot at the bus stop. He finds it unusual and feels that in some ways, Mrs. Sane is more responsible than his own mother, who would often keep her secluded away from him. Mrs. Sane practices driving each day with Elliot in the car. Mrs. Sane prefers to have Elliot in the car with her because driving scares her. She is nervous and distracted while driving, and she is too afraid to drive on the main road with other cars. One day, a letter informs her that her sister has given birth to a baby girl. Mrs. Sane is thrilled by this news but sad that the girl will be 3 years old by the time she first sees her. She hugs Elliot and reads it excitedly, reminiscing about her home and family members in India. She gives Elliot updates on family members and grieves that she will not be able to see them for another 3 years because of Mr. Sane's work schedule. Mrs. Sane asks if Elliot misses his mother these afternoons. The thought had not occurred to him. She says he is wise. He already tastes the way things must be, that people are distant from each other. She suggests that there is no escape from loneliness. Elliot seems to agree. Mrs. Sane mentions that she loves fish, but she does not like the packed fish sold in the supermarket. She mentions how she used to get fresh fish back in Calcutta. She tells Elliot that in India, people eat fish twice a day and it frustrates her to live near the coast without access to fresh fish. She likes to reserve fish at a market near the beach, which Mr. Sane picks up for her. One day though, Mr. Sane tells Mrs. Sane that he won't have time to get the fish anymore because he needs to hold office hours. Mrs. Sane is upset and she confides in Elliot about how unhappy she is in America. She leads Elliot into her bedroom to display to him her large collection of saris, none of which she now wears. Her family thinks that she must be happy and rich here, but she is not. Later that evening, Mr. Sane relents and drives Mrs. Sane and Elliot to get the fish. In November, Elliot notices that Mrs. Sane is sad and depressed. She paces the apartment and plays a series of audio tapes. She tells Elliot she has learned by letter that her grandfather is dead. A week later, Mr. Sane arranges an expedition to the beach and the group buys lots of fish at the market. After they visit the market, they enjoy baskets of calm cakes at a take-out restaurant and walk for a while along the beach. They take some photos. Mr. Sane tells her to drive home and it is a disaster. She goes too slowly, becomes distracted by the radio and finally pulls over to the side of the road. She hates driving and refuses to drive again. Mrs. Sane learns the bus route and begins to take Elliot to the shore herself. On the bus, Mrs. Sane notices that there are a bunch of seniors because the bus stops at a nursing home. So that prompts her to ask Elliot whether or not he would place his mother in a nursing home. Elliot says maybe, but that he would visit her every day. Mrs. Sane denies this possibility. You say that now, but you will see, you will miss one day and another, and then she will have to drag herself onto a bus just to get herself a bag of lozenges. She suggests that distance and practicalities prevent people from connecting in the long term, and this is why loneliness is often permanent. A passenger on the bus notices the smell of fish and complains about it. Mrs. Sane is confronted and embarrassed by the bus driver. A few days later, when the next fish arrives, Mrs. Sane tells Elliot to put on his shoes. They pile into the car and Mrs. Sane attempts to merge onto the main road. Mrs. Sane gets Elliot and herself into a minor car accident. Mr. Sane arrives at the spot and takes care of the police officer, and then he talks to Elliot but ignores Mrs. Sane, showing his frustration. Although the damage is insignificant, after returning home, Mrs. Sane is very upset. She just totally shuts down. She goes into her room, shuts the door, and lets Mrs. Sane explain to Elliot's mom what happened. When Elliot's mother returns that evening, Mr. Sane apologizes for his wife and returns the past month's babysitting money. Elliot can hear Mrs. Sane crying in the other room. Elliot's mom tells him that she is relieved he will not have to go Mrs. Sane's anymore and that he can watch himself after school. When she asks Elliot if he is okay, he stares out at the grey waves and says he is fine. The grey waves outside shows his inner turmoil, but he knows he has no other way but to face the gloominess of loneliness, just like Mrs. Sane will have to. So this is it for today. We will continue to discuss the history of Indian English literature. Please stay connected with the discourse. Thanks and regards.